Okay, so something happened this week, and I genuinely haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I was catching up with my friend Daniela. We go way back, like college roommate back, and she looked incredible. Not in a shallow, surface-level way, but in that glowing, energized, my brain is working again kind of way. And I asked her what changed, half expecting her to say some new supplement or a fancy gym membership, and she just looked at me and said 2 words: intermittent fasting. And I sat there going, wait, seriously? That's it? Because honestly, I'd heard the term thrown around 1,000 times and kind of filed it under wellness trend, move on. But here's the thing about Daniela. She's not someone who chases trends. She's a biochemist. She reads actual research papers for fun on Sunday mornings, while the rest of us are watching cooking videos and regretting Saturday. So when she said intermittent fasting, she didn't just say it casually. She started explaining the cellular mechanisms, the metabolic shifts, the hormonal responses, and I'm sitting there over my oat milk latte going, okay, I clearly need to do a whole episode on this because I am not giving this conversation justice. And that's exactly how we got here today, so welcome to the show. I'm Alex Rivera, and this is the Healthy Change Podcast, where we don't just skim the surface of wellness topics. We actually dig in, get a little uncomfortable, ask the questions nobody's asking, and try to figure out what's real versus what's just really good marketing. And today we are going all in on intermittent fasting. We're going to talk about what it actually is, what the science says, why people swear by it, and this part is really important, who probably shouldn't be doing it. Because I think that last conversation gets left out way too often. And it matters. It really genuinely matters to me that we cover all of it. So let's start at the very beginning, because I think a lot of people hear intermittent fasting and they immediately picture someone dramatically refusing breakfast or surviving on coffee and willpower until 2 p.m. And okay, honestly, for some people that's not that far off. But the actual concept is so much richer and more intentional than that image suggests. At its core, intermittent fasting is not a diet in the traditional sense of the word. It's not about cutting out carbs or tracking every calorie down to the crumb. It's really an eating pattern, a structured way of cycling between periods of eating and periods of fasting, and the timing is the whole point. Now, here's something that I find genuinely fascinating and kind of puts the whole thing in perspective. Humans have actually been fasting for most of our evolutionary history, not by choice, but by circumstance. Our ancestors didn't have grocery stores open 24 hours a day. They didn't have snack cabinets or meal delivery apps. There were long stretches between hunts, between harvests, between finding food at all. So in a really interesting way, intermittent fasting isn't some new wellness invention. It's almost like a return to the eating rhythm our bodies were originally designed around. That reframe hit me pretty hard when I first really sat with it. And if you're hearing this and you've tried fasting before, maybe it lasted 2 days. Maybe you made it an hour past breakfast and then stood in front of the refrigerator having a full conversation with yourself about whether cheese counts as breaking a fast. Yeah, I see you. That's a really common experience because we live in a culture that has normalized eating constantly. 3 meals, multiple snacks, grazing while we work, eating while we scroll, eating while we watch, eating out of boredom, out of stress, out of habit. So asking the body to pause and create intentional windows without food, that's genuinely countercultural in the most interesting way. All right, so let's get into the actual methods because intermittent fasting is not a one-size-fits-all protocol. And I think this is where a lot of people get confused or overwhelmed. There are several popular approaches, and they vary quite a bit in terms of how demanding they are and how well they fit into different lifestyles. The most widely practiced method is called the 16-to-8 approach, which means you fast for 16 hours and then eat within an 8-hour window. So if you finish dinner at 8 in the evening and don't eat again until noon the next day, congratulations, you are doing the 16 to 8. Many people find this one the most manageable to maintain long term because it doesn't require skipping meals so much as shifting them. Then there's the 5 to 2 method, which looks a little different. You eat normally for 5 days of the week, and on 2 non-consecutive days, you significantly restrict your calorie intake, usually to around 500 to 600 calories. So it's not a complete fast on those 2 days, but it's a substantial reduction. Some people really love this approach because it doesn't require daily discipline. You just have 2 intentional light days, and the rest of the week looks pretty normal. My friend Marco, who is a high school teacher with 3 kids and basically zero time for complicated routines, swears this one changed his relationship with food without overhauling his entire life. There's also Eat Stop Eat, which involves fasting for a full 24 hours once or twice a week. So you'd finish dinner on Monday night and not eat again until dinner on Tuesday. That one is definitely more intense, and I want to be upfront. It's not for everyone, and I think it requires a really solid relationship with hunger and food before you even consider it. And then there's the warrior diet, which takes a more extreme approach, with a 20-hour fast followed by a 4-hour eating window, typically in the evening. That one draws from historical warrior cultures, and the idea that our ancestors were active during the day and feasted at night. Interesting concept, high commitment level. And then there's alternate day fasting, where you quite literally alternate between regular eating days and fasting days, sometimes complete fasting, sometimes very low calorie intake. Research on this one has shown some interesting results, but it's also the hardest to sustain socially and psychologically for most people. I mean, imagine trying to have a normal Tuesday while your coworkers are ordering lunch and you're just there with your sparkling water trying to look unbothered. It takes a very specific kind of mental fortitude, and there's absolutely no shame in acknowledging that some methods are better suited to different people, personalities, schedules, and life circumstances. Okay, so now let's get into the part that I personally find the most mind-blowing, the actual science of what happens inside your body when you fast. Because this isn't just about eating less food in a smaller window. When you stop eating and your body fully processes the last meal, something really remarkable begins to unfold at a cellular and hormonal level, and understanding this changed the way I think about the whole practice. The first thing that shifts is your insulin levels. When you eat, especially carbohydrates and sugars, your pancreas releases insulin to help your cells absorb glucose for energy. But when you're fasting, insulin levels drop significantly, and that drop is actually really important for what comes next. When insulin is low and your body has burned through its available glucose, something called metabolic switching happens. Your body starts turning to stored fat as its primary fuel source. It breaks down fat cells and converts them into fatty acids and a compound called ketone bodies, which your brain and muscles can use for energy. This state is called ketosis, and yes, it's related to what people on ketogenic diets are chasing. But with intermittent fasting, you can reach a mild version of it naturally just through timing your eating. Daniela explained this to me with so much excitement, drawing diagrams on a napkin, and I sat there thinking, why did no one teach this in health class? This is genuinely fascinating stuff, but the metabolic shift is just one piece of it. There's also a process called autophagy, and this one, I need you to hear this. This one might be the most exciting biological mechanism I've learned about in years. Autophagy literally translates from Greek to mean self-eating, which sounds alarming but is actually one of the most elegant things your cells do. During a fast, when the body isn't focused on digesting and processing food, it turns inward and starts cleaning house. It identifies damaged, dysfunctional, or old cellular components and literally breaks them down and recycles them for energy or to build new, healthier structures. It's essentially your body's built-in maintenance and renewal system. And autophagy isn't just a cool biological tidbit. It has enormous implications for disease prevention and aging. Yoshinori Osumi won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2016, specifically for his research on autophagy mechanisms. Nobel Prize. This is not fringe science or wellness influencer content. This is peer-reviewed, internationally recognized research. Studies have linked enhanced autophagy to reduced risk of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, to better cancer prevention, and to improved immune function. The body literally has the capacity to clean itself from the inside when we give it the time and space to do so, and fasting is one of the most powerful ways to trigger that process. Now let's talk about human growth hormone, or HGH, because this is another one that shows up in the research and is honestly pretty remarkable. Studies have shown that fasting can increase human growth hormone levels by anywhere from 5 to 10-fold. That's a massive jump. And why does that matter? Because human growth hormone plays a crucial role in fat metabolism, specifically helping your body burn fat for fuel, as well as in muscle preservation and overall tissue repair. So there's this interesting paradox where people worry that fasting will cause muscle loss, when in fact, the hormonal environment created by fasting may actually be protective of lean muscle mass under the right conditions. That nuance is worth sitting with for a minute. There's also research showing that intermittent fasting can have a really positive impact on insulin sensitivity. Over time, regularly cycling through fasting periods can train your cells to respond more effectively to insulin, which means your body needs to produce less of it to do the same job. This is huge for people managing or at risk for type 2 diabetes, because insulin resistance, where your cells stop responding well to insulin, is at the core of that condition. A study published in the journal Cell Metabolism showed significant improvements in insulin sensitivity in participants who practiced time-restricted eating, and those results appeared relatively quickly, within just a few weeks of starting the protocol. That's encouraging data. And then there's the brain. Oh, the brain piece. This is where I get genuinely emotional, because mental clarity and cognitive function are things so many of us are quietly struggling with. The brain fog, the afternoon slumps, the feeling of just not being sharp the way you used to be. Intermittent fasting has been linked to increased production of a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Think of BDNF as fertilizer for your brain. It supports the growth of new neurons, strengthens neural connections, and plays a significant role in learning, memory, and mood regulation. Low BDNF has been associated with depression and cognitive decline, so naturally boosting it through fasting is something researchers find incredibly promising. I want to take a second here and just acknowledge something, because I think about you, the person listening, a lot. And I know some of you are probably hearing all of this and feeling a mix of excitement and maybe a little bit of skepticism. Or maybe you're thinking, okay, but I've tried things like this before and it didn't work out. Or it felt miserable. Or it brought up some stuff around food that wasn't easy to deal with. And all of that is valid. So valid. We're going to talk about the real challenges and the real contraindications later in this episode, because I refuse to be the kind of wellness podcast that just sells you the highlight reel without the full picture. Let's shift into the benefits. And I want to go beyond the obvious ones, because I think weight loss tends to dominate this conversation in a way that honestly undersells everything else that's happening. Yes, intermittent fasting can support fat loss. Studies consistently show that it leads to reductions in body weight and body fat percentage, largely because restricting your eating window naturally tends to reduce overall calorie intake, and the hormonal environment it creates actively supports fat burning. But if we stop the conversation there, we miss so much. Because the benefits that people report and that research is increasingly confirming, touch almost every system in the body in some really meaningful way. Take cardiovascular health, for example. A number of studies have found that intermittent fasting can lead to significant improvements in several major risk factors for heart disease, including reductions in LDL cholesterol, triglycerides, blood pressure, and inflammatory markers. Chronic inflammation is increasingly understood as a central driver of heart disease, and fasting appears to have a measurable anti-inflammatory effect. One study in the Journal of the American Heart Association found that participants who practiced time-restricted eating showed improvements in blood pressure comparable to what you might see from certain blood pressure medications. That's not a small thing. That's the kind of finding that should be in the news cycle way more than it is. There's also compelling research around longevity, the actual length and quality of your life. Studies in animal models have consistently shown that caloric restriction and fasting can extend lifespan, sometimes dramatically. Now, we're not quite at the point where we can say definitively that this translates directly to the same degree in humans, but the mechanisms, autophagy, reduced oxidative stress, lower inflammation, improved metabolic markers, are all pathways that researchers believe contribute to healthier aging. And there's something beautifully poetic about the idea that by periodically doing less, eating less, consuming less, your body actually gets more time and more capacity to repair and renew itself. Let me share another real-world example here, because I think data is one thing, but human stories are what actually land. My colleague James, thoughtful guy, early 40s, had been dealing with pretty persistent low-level inflammation and joint pain that his doctors kept chalking up to just getting older. Started doing a modified 16-8 protocol about 6 months ago. Within about 8 weeks, he noticed his joint pain had significantly decreased. He started sleeping better, his energy in the mornings improved, and he told me he felt sharper in meetings. Now, he didn't change his diet dramatically. He didn't start a new exercise program. The primary variable was the eating window. And while that's one person's experience, it echoes what a lot of people report. Gut health is another area where intermittent fasting shows some really interesting promise. Your gut microbiome, the trillions of bacteria and microorganisms living in your digestive tract, has a profound influence on everything from immunity to mood to metabolism. And it turns out that your gut microbiome has its own circadian rhythm. When you eat at all hours, late nights, early mornings, constant snacking, you disrupt that rhythm. Intermittent fasting, especially time-restricted eating aligned with daylight hours, appears to support a healthier and more diverse gut microbiome. Some researchers describe the fasting window as essentially giving your gut a rest and a reset, time to repair the intestinal lining and rebalance the microbial community. And then there's the psychological and behavioral side of intermittent fasting that I find really compelling and don't think gets enough attention. A lot of people who practice it consistently describe a shift in their relationship with hunger. Early on, hunger feels urgent and uncomfortable, like something that needs to be fixed immediately. But over time, many people report learning to distinguish between real physiological hunger and habitual eating, or emotional eating, or boredom-driven eating. There's a kind of mindfulness that develops around food and hunger cues that extends beyond the fasting window itself and starts influencing food choices and eating behaviors throughout the day. That's a genuinely valuable skill, and it's hard to put a number on its impact. I want to be real about the adaptation period, though, because I think glossing over it does people a disservice. The first week or two of intermittent fasting can be legitimately hard. Your body is used to a constant supply of glucose. When you suddenly create these extended gaps between eating, your brain sends pretty loud signals: hunger pangs, irritability, difficulty concentrating, headaches, fatigue. Some people call this the fasting flu, and it's a real thing. It's not a sign that fasting is wrong for you. It's often just your body adjusting to a new fuel sourcing pattern. But you deserve to know it's coming so you don't hit day 3 feeling terrible and conclude that fasting is broken. Hydration during fasting is something that often gets underemphasized and is actually really important. When you're not eating, you're also not getting the water content that naturally comes from food, which accounts for about 20 to 30% of daily fluid intake for many people. So increasing intentional water consumption during fasting windows isn't optional, it's essential. Electrolytes also matter, particularly sodium, potassium, and magnesium, especially during longer fasts. Some people drink black coffee or plain herbal tea during their fasting window, and for most protocols, this doesn't break the fast, though there's some nuance depending on who you ask and what specific benefits you're trying to optimize for. I also want to address something I hear a lot, the fear that fasting will tank your metabolism. It's a common concern, and it has some basis in reality when it comes to very prolonged, very severe caloric restriction over long periods of time. Your body does have mechanisms to slow metabolism when it senses starvation. But intermittent fasting, particularly shorter fasting windows like 16 to 8, doesn't appear to trigger that same metabolic adaptation. In fact, some research suggests that short-term fasting may actually slightly increase metabolic rate due to the release of norepinephrine, a hormone that helps your body mobilize stored fat. The key distinction is duration and severity. This is not starvation, it's structured timing. Now I want to start laying the groundwork for a conversation we're going to go deep on shortly, which is who intermittent fasting is not right for. Because I think the wellness space does this thing where practice gets celebrated, momentum builds, everyone starts doing it, and then the nuance disappears. And the nuance here is genuinely life-affecting. People with a history of disordered eating, people who are pregnant or breastfeeding, people with certain metabolic conditions, children and adolescents still growing. These are populations where fasting can cause real harm. And I want us to hold both things at once. This practice can be genuinely powerful and transformative for many people, and it is not appropriate or safe for everyone. There's a broader cultural conversation here too that I can't step past, and it has to do with who gets to talk about food restriction comfortably and without stigma. The wellness industry has a complicated history with thin idealization and diet culture, and intermittent fasting exists in that context, whether we acknowledge it or not. For someone who has spent years recovering from anorexia or bulimia, being told to restrict eating to a specific window might trigger thought patterns that are genuinely dangerous. The language of fasting, skipping meals, eating less, the satisfaction of going longer without food, can be activating for people in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. This deserves more than a disclaimer. It deserves an actual conversation. So here's where we are at this point in the episode. We've established what intermittent fasting actually is. We've walked through the major protocols. We've gotten into the science. Insulin, ketosis, autophagy, BDNF, human growth hormone. And we've started unpacking the benefits that go way beyond the weight conversation. We've touched on the adaptation period, the real challenges of the early weeks. And I've started flagging that this isn't a practice for everyone. What I want to do next is go even deeper into the specific populations who should approach this carefully or avoid it entirely, into practical implementation strategies for people who want to start thoughtfully, and into the questions I genuinely haven't stopped thinking about since that conversation with Daniela over coffee. Stay with me, because we're just getting to the good part. Okay, so let's talk about the people who genuinely need to be careful here. And I mean that with full seriousness, not as a liability disclaimer thrown in at the end of an otherwise enthusiastic pitch. If you have a history of disordered eating, anorexia, bulimia, binge-restrict cycling, orthorexia, intermittent fasting is not a neutral tool for you. It may feel like structure. It may even feel like control in a way that seems positive at first, But for many people in recovery, that same structure becomes a permission slip for a restriction that spirals. Please talk to a therapist or a registered dietitian who specializes in eating disorders before you even consider this. Your history matters, and it deserves to be part of this conversation. Pregnant and breastfeeding individuals are another group where I want to be really direct. This is not the time to experiment with fasting protocols. Your body has dramatically increased nutrient and caloric demands during pregnancy and lactation, and restricting eating windows can interfere with fetal development, milk supply, and your own hormonal stability. I've seen wellness content that tries to soften this with phrases like, "listen to your body," as though that's a sufficient guardrail, and I don't think it is. The research on fasting during pregnancy is limited, and the potential downside is too significant to treat casually. If you're curious about nutrition optimization during this season of life, there are approaches that genuinely support you. This particular one isn't it. Children and teenagers are also not appropriate candidates for intermittent fasting, and I think this needs to be said loudly because diet culture absolutely trickles down into younger age groups. Adolescents are in active growth phases. Their brains, bones, and hormonal systems are still developing, and consistent, adequate nutrition is foundational to that process. Restricting meal timing in young people can disrupt growth hormones, interfere with puberty, and plant the seeds of disordered eating at an age when identity and body image are already vulnerable. If a young person in your life is asking about fasting, that's worth a genuine conversation about why, not a how-to guide. People managing type 1 diabetes or those on insulin or sulfonylurea medications for type 2 diabetes need to work very closely with their doctor before attempting any fasting protocol. The reason is straightforward but serious. Fasting changes blood glucose dynamics, and if your medication dosing isn't adjusted accordingly, you can end up with hypoglycemia, which is genuinely dangerous. I want to be clear that I'm not saying fasting and diabetes management are incompatible across the board. There is actually emerging research suggesting potential benefits for some people with type 2 diabetes under medical supervision. But the emphasis there is on medical supervision. This is not a self-guided experiment for anyone whose blood sugar regulation involves medication. Now let's talk about implementation for people who've been listening and thinking, okay, this could genuinely be something I want to try. The most important thing I can tell you is to start smaller than you think you need to. If you've never experimented with fasting at all, jumping straight into a 16-8 protocol might feel overwhelming in the first week. Some people do really well, starting with a 12-hour fast, eating between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., for example, and then gradually extending that window as their body adapts and their confidence builds. That's not the slow lane, that's just being smart about change. Sustainable shifts are built incrementally, and the people I've talked to who stick with fasting long-term almost always describe starting gently. Meal composition during your eating window matters a lot more than people sometimes realize going in. There's a temptation, and I've heard this from so many people, to treat the eating window as a reward period and load it with processed, high-sugar, calorie-dense food because you've been fasting. But that approach is going to undermine almost every benefit we talked about earlier. Insulin spikes from highly refined carbohydrates will counteract the metabolic signaling benefits, energy levels will crash, and hunger during fasting windows will be harder to manage. Prioritizing protein, healthy fats, fiber-rich vegetables, and complex carbohydrates during your eating window makes the fasting period physically easier and amplifies the cellular and metabolic benefits you're actually trying to access. Sleep is an underrated ally in any fasting protocol, and this is one of my favorite pieces of practical advice to share because it reframes the whole thing. If you're doing a 16-8 fast and you're sleeping 8 hours, you're already fasting for 8 of those 16 hours while unconscious. That means you only have to extend 8 more hours of waking fasting, which is so much more manageable than it sounds on paper. Some people structure their eating window from noon to 8 in the evening, which means they skip breakfast, eat a satisfying lunch, have dinner before 8, and go about their evening normally. That's it. It fits into a regular life without requiring extraordinary willpower. It just requires a little planning and a shift in routine. I want to circle back to something I mentioned early in this episode. That conversation I had with Daniela over coffee that kind of cracked this whole thing open for me again. She said something that's been sitting with me ever since, and it was this. The most radical thing about intermittent fasting for her wasn't the weight she lost or the mental clarity she found. It was that it fundamentally changed her relationship with hunger. She stopped being afraid of it. She stopped interpreting hunger as an emergency that had to be solved immediately. In that shift, learning to sit with a physical sensation without panic or reactivity had ripple effects in her life that went way beyond food. She described it as a kind of emotional training. That stayed with me, because I think that's the piece that doesn't get talked about enough in the clinical literature or the wellness content, the psychological dimension of what happens when you stop organizing your entire day around eating. For a lot of us, and I include myself in this, food has become a primary coping mechanism, a social glue, a reward system, a way to fill time or manage emotion. And when you create a fasting structure, you suddenly have all these moments where you would have reached for food and now you're just there with the feeling underneath it. That can be incredibly uncomfortable, especially at first. But it can also be the beginning of a lot of insight if you let it be. Not everyone is ready for that, and that's okay too. So what's the actual takeaway here? What do I want you to walk away with from this episode? I think it's this. Intermittent fasting is a genuinely evidence-supported practice with a meaningful body of research behind it, a range of real benefits that extend far beyond weight loss, and a track record that makes it worth considering seriously. It is also not a magic solution, not appropriate for everyone, not a substitute for overall nutritional quality, and not something to approach as another form of punishment or control. It works best when it's aligned with your actual life, your health history, your goals, and your relationship with your own body. The science is compelling. The implementation requires honesty. If you're someone who's been curious about this for a while, I hope this episode gave you the information you needed to make a genuinely informed decision. Not a hype-driven one, not a fear-driven one, but a thoughtful one. If you're someone who tried fasting and it didn't work for you, I hope it helped you understand why, and that there's no moral failure in that. If you're someone who fasting is not right for medically, psychologically, or just personally, I hope you feel like that was fully acknowledged today, not just as a footnote. And if you're someone who's been doing this for years and just wanted to go deep on the science, I hope the autophagy and BDNF rabbit holes were worth the ride. I genuinely loved putting this one together. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I don't take it lightly, and I mean that every single episode. If something from today's conversation landed for you, I'd love to hear about it. If you know someone who's been asking questions about intermittent fasting or trying to figure out if it's right for them, please share this episode with them. That's how this little community grows, and it means everything. Take care of yourselves out there. Drink your water, eat your vegetables, sleep enough, and be kind to your body. It's doing its absolute best. I'll talk to you next week.